proceed.
So thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the organizers for having me here and for my friends who convinced and managed to get the resources to get me here. These are very different types of presentations, of course. I want to start with the last one, which is, I think, more along the traditional research lines, and I had some very sort of specific comments to make, and then move on to the broader policy type of issues that were discussed by our other presenters today, all of whom have done a very nice job. So with regard to the paper that I read from Agnieszka, it's a very interesting paper, and I completely agree with the conclusion, and also I'm surprised by what you found and what we found in terms of that type of analysis not being done. In Latin America, we see a number of pieces that have been done on this. Alvaro Forteza has done a piece using administrative data from pension systems, actually. So there's really, it's puzzling for me coming here and talking to Agnieszka and finding out that this data is not that accessible, and I'm surprised. It must be in the information systems of these institutions. I remember speaking to somebody from the Central Bank of Italy a few years ago. It was actually in Krakow, and he was telling me about what happened when they introduced the notional accounts and were trying to go, the notional defined contribution, trying to go backwards with the history, and what a mess of paper records they found. And I've had friends working on the reforms in Greece, and each of these cases, the information systems and the data that's available in those systems really places a limit. Agnieszka's written about it in the case of Poland, the struggle to introduce certain types of reforms that require this type of information, which is basically individualized information on contributions, wages, and retirement history. But it should be available, and I think there should be a lesson here to put more effort into not only producing that type of data regularly, but then doing some analysis. Because one of my concerns about this index is the reliance on the cross-sectional rather than the cohort-specific data that's there. And it's really hard for me to understand why it doesn't exist out there. So that's the first point. The second point, there are some, in part of the paper, it refers to the effect of the pension system's progressivity on the retirement of women. And the point is very true, that at a certain point, if you're having a partial career and you're low wage, then you're going to get the minimum pension in many of these systems. So working that extra year is not really going to provide you anything. What I would like to see is more of the analysis from that perspective, where we actually measure the change in the pension wealth, as in sort of the Gruber-Wise type of literature. You measured the change in pension wealth for one extra year of work for different types of women. And if you did that, we'd probably find that that extra year of work is nothing but a tax. So why should she work longer? But we can, if we have that measure, we can start to see if behavior is matching with this implicit tax. And this is an issue specifically, I'm talking about the role of the minimum pension in the contributory pension scheme. But it's a more general point that I want to come back to when I talk about Nick's presentation in particular. And that is the need to de-link redistribution from the savings aspect of the system. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But I just want to connect it to this particular point, which is minimum pensions in a contributory system where women have shorter careers of contribution and lower wages will inevitably mean that women will be taxed for extra years of work in that type of arrangement. But we'll come back to that general point. But in the same part of that paper, we talk about the progressivity and benefits affecting the incentive to contribute. Why do we restrict ourselves to only thinking about this traditional minimum pension, why can't we think about policies like what Singapore does, which is to put in extra contributions from the state into the low-income workers' accounts, for example. Or we could think of a sort of earned income tax credit approach where you actually phase in contributions into people's accounts. Or the other way of thinking about it, and we'll come back to this one as well, is how Chile is now doing their social pension. Because Chile has done a very elegant thing where they actually phase out the social pension as the contributory pension increases, but in a very gradual way, so you minimize that distortion that we often find in systems. And the last point I want to make, and this is a bit of a picky thing, I suppose, but the indexation factor that you're mentioning here is the problem seems to be that because women live longer, if indexation is less than 100% to wages, then eventually their replacement rate is going to become very low in a growing economy. But what we should be equalizing, in my view, is not the flow or the replacement rate at any given point, but the present value of that stream, namely the pension wealth, which implies that women should have a higher retirement age than men. If that's the problem, then they should work longer.
You have supporters on this one.
I'm going to give you an even more exotic proposal in a moment. That wasn't exotic at all, actually. But so let me move to Nick's presentation. And as usual, there are lots of things to agree with Nick on, and he always does a marvelous job of presenting these things better than I can ever do. One of those things that we agree on a lot is that New Zealand is a great case, and you know, as people often ask, what's the best pension system you can think of? And you know, New Zealand actually comes to my mind a lot. We can agree on flexible retirement. I think there's some interesting experience in Japan that I've been studying recently that we could learn from in this part of the world in terms of partial retirement as opposed to this very sharp, discontinuous retirement. They have the highest labor force participation rate among male 60-plus-year-olds among the rich countries, and it's partly because of this policy. The behavioral stuff, I think I agree with everything you've said there, and I think everybody should become literate in the behavioral economics as it relates to pensions. I don't know why you sort of put in the unbundling part in that section with behavior. The unbundling, I call it unbundling. This is the separation of the asset management and the record keeping, and I think that's, if we were to do these systems again from scratch, I think it's exactly the way we would do them. And there are cases, actually, the Indians actually have done this. So thrift savings plan is one example, but a developing country example is the Indian example, where they have managed to really drive down the cost. So we agree on a lot of things, I think. I think, you know, reading the paper, which was the basis of what I was commenting on, I think I hope you're going to update the story and refine the story on the defined contributions. The paper seems a little schizophrenic to me in a way, in the sense that there's one section that sort of says the crisis really killed the DC schemes and they lost all this money and so on, and then later we talk about DCs as part of the solution in places like New Zealand and the UK, but in a different spirit. But I think, you know, I think we've moved to the point now where, you know, we're going, as Olivia Mitchell's book is entitled Living with Defined Contributions is the question. So the questions you raise about the behavioral issues, the choices and the portfolio choices and so on, those are the things we probably should spend the most time on. Not DCs are here to stay. They're going to be increasing even in places like the Netherlands, which is essentially, which was always sort of, to me, the bastion of funded defined benefit schemes, and is now, as it was the last holdout, and is now sort of moving much more in towards a kind of defined contribution. Yeah, but the risk is now being shared in a different way than in the defined benefit scheme. So let me move to a lot of you in this room, probably some of you are too young, some of you were not aware of it at the time, but 20 years ago, next month, there was a publication that came out from the World Bank called Averting the Old Age Crisis. And Nick refers to it in his paper. And by the way, I agree with everything you say. I just wonder why sometimes you don't find it in that book. That book is 415 pages. I know Nick has read it thoroughly, and some of the people here have, but not too many people really have. So often things are said about that book, which when I go back and look at it now, after 20 years, I say, there is the section. There's a 40-page section on transitions from pay-go to funding. It's not missing, and so on. Anyway, I had to get that off my chest, but that debate, for those of you, that went on for and has gone on for decades, and it's nice that the book is still mentioned, even if it's in criticism. But that being said, the debate at that time was really, and this is 1994, was really about, it focused on that book and its focus on private management, the role of the private sector, and funding versus pay-as-you-go. I don't want to talk about those things. It's gone on for a long time. That'll be the subject of other discussions. But what is relevant here, I think, is the message that was kind of forgotten from the book, which was the separation of redistribution from savings. That was a real key principle that was laid out. And it sort of wasn't a hot topic, but now, 20 years later, I think that's where the focus needs to be more. And that's where we talk about the role of the social pensions that Nick is talking about. And I really agree with the fact that we're going to have to move away from such reliance on payroll tax financed pension systems. What I don't quite agree on is the motivation. In the countries I work in the low and middle income countries, coverage has never been high. So this has always been this initial condition that required some complementary role for a non-payroll tax finance pension system. And even in the industrial world, if we go back, we see that coverage was partial for decades, and then only after decades did it become universal. So, the last century started with two big pension introductions, the New Zealand one and Bismarck in Germany. For whatever historical reasons that someone else will do better at finding out, New Zealand's model spread very slowly. And maybe 50 years later, there were 6 like it. But the Bismarck and the social insurance, that spread like wildfire. And by the end of the century, most countries had adopted that type of system, including poor countries that will never have coverage of a payroll tax finance system that is higher than 20% in my lifetime. So I think you're absolutely right that we have to look at the role of social pensions, but here's where we need to do more work, I think, because we can't sort of lump together New Zealand, Chile, Australia. We have to look for different types of social pension designs that are going to work well with the existing contributory design. Chile has done a very nice thing. They are not a universal flat pension. They basically are doing a social pension for the bottom 60% of the population in a very sophisticated way that requires very good information systems that allows you to essentially means test it, but not do it in such a way that you have a big disincentive to contribute to the contributory scheme. And that's a very hard thing to do, and it will be different in each country. But we do agree on the general point, I think, that the non-contributory schemes have to be part of it. And it doesn't have to just be a social pension. That's an ex post intervention with using general revenues. We can also use general revenues to put money into accounts as we're going along, ex ante. In sophisticated ways, of course, not simplistic. I thought the Italian discussion was a very good example of how these systems that do not separate redistribution from savings cleanly become become a mess. Because when you say that we can do better, the politicians say we can do better, they shouldn't have a choice to do better, because if it's very clear what you're doing, this is for redistribution and this piece is for savings. This is savings. That is much more difficult for a politician to toy with and to complicate. And after 50 years of people changing rules and giving this benefit, extra benefit to this person, because it's not clearly a savings vehicle, it becomes this mess, this monster. And shifting to NDC is actually a way to try to clear that up and go back to the saving. So it looks and it feels and it is a savings principle. I say, well, why not go even further? And this is where my exotic proposal comes in. And this is really something that Santiago Levy had proposed a few years ago in the case of Mexico. And he was concerned that, he's very concerned still, that in Mexico you have a very large informal sector, maybe 60% of the labor force. And you've created a system for informal sector workers and a system for formal sector workers that encourages this to continue. And it leads to low productivity of the labor in the informal sector, and it leads to a dichotomous labor force. So what he advocated was, let's open an individual account for every adult in Mexico, and we will put in a contribution from the government, starting with age 18. And this will grow, and we're choosing the amount that we put in this account in such a way so it produces the minimum pension when the person is 65. Over and above that is pure savings. For the formal sector, it's mandated, and hopefully informal sector workers will participate, but they probably won't. But everybody will have this piece. Everybody will have this one piece. And you could even start it at birth if you wanted to do it that way. Now, is that expensive? Well, you can do it slowly or you can do it quickly. It's essentially pre-funding the social pension that you are already going to provide. So for somebody that's 65 today in Mexico, they get a social pension. But that now what they're trying to do is pre-fund that and make it individual property. So it's it's pure savings. Anyway, I've taken up too much time. I'm sure we can discuss these things, and I'm sure you have comments and questions, but thank you for having me.